I have a series of classes I put together in my mind what would be the perfect introduction to rhetoric from a classical liberal arts perspective for young students. And it involves, first of all, fundamentals of speech. And in that, I would introduce my students to the 5 canons of rhetoric and the liberal arts, the 7 classical liberal arts, and I would explain to them the role of rhetoric in the 7 classical liberal arts, very much like I did. Now I can use a PowerPoint to do that with my students after yesterday. And in terms of the 5 canons of rhetoric, I wanted to give all of you the payoff for coming this morning of actually teaching those 5 canons for you. Although they are on the website, but I thought I can review them in like 5 minutes for you. But in terms of the techne of rhetoric, the 5 canons provide the sub-arts of the art of rhetoric, and they provide a guide to people who are crafting speeches. So you can think of them in terms of 5 questions that you would ask yourself as you're in the process of crafting a speech, okay? Hi. Yes, ma'am. Imitatio. Oh, very good.
Okay.
Pastor Scheiser's here now. He's more entertaining than me. I want eloquence. I'm more eloquent. No, he's pretty eloquent. No. This actually would work well with junior high. Vision, style, memory, delivery. Those are the 5 classical canons of rhetoric. They were codified in the Roman era.
What's it again?
Invention, disposition, style, memory, and delivery. Aristotle talked about invention, disposition, and style to a lesser extent in his treatise on rhetoric. And then over the next 400 years, it developed into the 5 classical canons. Invention has to do with what is there to say. The question you'd ask yourself is, okay, let's imagine you have to give a speech. What is there to say? And that would involve researching the topic, consulting your own knowledge on the topic, and trying to decide an angle and narrow the topic. That's all involved in invention. Disposition is arrangement. That's a good synonym for it. Arrangement. The next thing, after you decide your angle and you narrow the topic, you ask yourself, okay, now what would be a logical way to arrange this material? And I don't teach, in textbooks, they teach chronological arrangement, spatial arrangement, logical arrangement, and all this stuff. I really don't see a lot of benefit in trying to make a science out of arrangement. I just teach them Plato's clumsy butcher analogy. Have you ever heard Plato's clumsy butcher analogy? I can't remember what word. Thank you very much. You're a clever techie. A clumsy butcher takes a chicken. Okay, now we're talking about arranging the topic, okay? A clumsy butcher takes a chicken and just hacks it to pieces and makes a big mess of it. But a clever butcher, well, let me show you. How's that for baiting your audience? Where's the mouse feel?
Is it a finger?
Is this a finger pass? Oh, that's it? Okay.
It's just a little, done the whole thing, and he just kind of steered that.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Never used one of these. Okay, so... Double click. I lost my timing. I was looking for Enya. Okay,
Full screen.
I'm so glad you're here.
Professor, will this be on the exam?
Yes. Do you? There you go. Okay, yeah, that'll be better. Thanks a lot. Okay. Now, how would I get the, I think I'd be faster to just go to the address strip and change the address. How would I?
Pull up a chair.
Thank you. Looks like I almost have it there. Okay, so anyway, forget that. A clever butcher recognizes that there are natural divisions called joints and divides the chicken cleanly into joints. So I teach that when I'm talking to my students about arranging their topics, because I think an image like that sticks with people better. And then, what's your name? Paul. Thank you, Paul. This,
You can probably just type it right in there, now if you want to take it here.
yeah.
Now, so if you want to just type it in the address, I think we can edit it there. Go back.
Okay, and that would be butcher. That's half the reason I wanted to go. Okay, so what I just said is explained here. Okay, and then we'll go back. That is really strange. Is there a command? Alt back. Back arrow. Okay. Oh, control arrow. Okay. Okay, well, this is the address for the home page. Okay? And they just switched servers, so instead of Cold Fusion, you should use learn.sdstate.edu. That's the one I had on my PowerPoint. That's because we just changed servers, but I have to switch some pages around, and I haven't done it yet. So Cold Fusion actually is better now, but by the end of the summer, Learn will be best. And on the new Learn one, they took out the Enya. So it's learn.sdstate.edu/. Tallmon J, and that's all you need. Okay, so anyway, I just wasted a whole lot of time, but it would have been a lot worse without Paul here. So, in my world, to start with those 5 classical canons and Aristotle's definition of rhetoric and ethos, pathos, and logos that's the way to lay a theoretical foundation for their understanding the art of rhetoric. And I present them the concept of art versus intuition so they can understand what we mean by art in the first place. And Aristotle makes a really good point. I think it's in the Topics. It's one of the Organon, one of his works on logic. And the Topics is where Aristotle teaches his students dialectic. And in that, he talks about the difference between building a knack and imparting an art. And you can't impart an art without a theoretical foundation. I probably don't have to elaborate on that with this group at all. But anyway, that's why I teach in my Speech 101 sections, I teach them all this stuff because I'm trying to impart an art in terms of the trivium, which is totally foreign to them. So, I started with invention, disposition, and we're talking about the 5 canons as a guide to crafting a speech. And there are questions you would ask yourself as you're in this process. The third one would be, once you have a blueprint, once you have an outline, once you've been a clever butcher and identified the natural divisions of the topic and decided, okay, this would make sense to arrange it this way, then you have to ask yourself, okay, where is my climax? What is the most important point here? Because all points are not equally important, correct? Okay, so style is an art of emphasis. And so you ask yourself, where and how will I emphasize the most important points, and where should I place them in the speech? Now, friends, we all do this intuitively. But if you want to acquire an art, you have to deliberately, rationally reflect, or what's the word? Anyway, you have to reflect on why you're doing what you're doing in the process of crafting the speech. So, style can be broken down into ornamentation and orchestration. Put a little fork there. Ornamentation, orchestration. Ornamentation is a matter of imagery, and orchestration is a matter of rhythm. Then later in the semester, see, I teach this in a very graduated fashion, and they have assignments at every point. I try to give them a little more theory, give them some nuts and bolts, and then they have an opportunity to practice what they've learned in an assignment, a little more theory, a little more nuts and bolts. So I'll teach them the basics of organization and nuts and bolts right off the bat, and they'll have a simple little demonstration type speech. But then the guts of my 101 course is built around a policy controversy and of their choosing, and they research it, and then they give an informative speech where they give the audience the background of the problem and who the key players are on both sides and kind of a general sketch of it. Then the second speech is called a policy analysis speech, and that's where they really get in depth. And I teach them a little tool called the stock issues model, which you can learn off my website. I don't want to go into it now. But that helps them organize, debaters use it, and that helps them organize the clash, a discussion of the clash of issues in the controversy. Okay? And then I also ask them to identify some of the underlying assumptions. Two groups of people can look at the same data and arrive at diametrically opposed conclusions. How do they do that? Well, they draw different inferences from it. They interpret the data based on their assumptions. So I try to equip them by teaching them a little bit about syllogistic logic at that point to identify assumptions. And then, in those first 2 speeches, they're not allowed to make their position known. Okay? Then, they give a persuasive speech, and to equip them for the persuasive speech, that's the capstone of the course. At that point, I do a lot of logic. I talk about dialectic and common material fallacies to equip them for the persuasive speech. But then at the very end, I use Bacon's definition for rhetoric, which helps highlight the importance of style, of imagery in persuasion. Because if you want to move remember yesterday I said you need to pique the imagination, which stirs the emotions, which moves the will. That's built right on Bacon's definition of rhetoric. And that's on the website too. But that's a great introduction to style. And then what I do is I give them a glossary of schemes and tropes, which I'll show you today. And then I talk to them about persuasion is not merely a matter of stacking data upon data. You need to appeal to our passions, and in order to do that, you have to paint vivid images, and that's where figures of speech come in. So it's a whole package that way. You give them some logic, and you give them some style and imagination. But that provides then a really good foundation to branch out into an argumentation class, a little course on argumentation, and in that you really hit heavy on formal and informal logic, and then you do a lot of case argument. If you're approaching argumentation from a classical point of view and a rhetorical point of view, you don't teach them logic as a subject and then give them tests on it. You teach them how to argue a case in a variety of domains. And Aristotle suggests those domains, actually. I do a unit on forensic argumentation, and then they analyze a First Amendment decision. I've got a list of First Amendment cases. I like to keep it to free speech issues, since it's in my area of expertise pretty much. And they do an argumentation analysis of what makes, they pick the part of the argument that makes most sense to them and seems most powerful to them, and then they analyze it in a paper. Then the next unit, and the theory builds on what they learned in the forensic unit. Actually, first of all, you'd really like this too. First of all, I teach them formal logic. I do what I call a boot camp of the mind. And I give them a little graduation certificate when they're done and all that. It's really cute. But I just jam formal logic into them really quickly in the first 3 weeks of class. And then I tell them, okay, you need to give a philosophical speech. What? You need to go to the great books of the Western world, grab the Syntopicon. You know the Syntopicon of the great books? Flip through there until you find a topic that interests you, and then read the introductory essay and go through the outline until you find something that triggers your interest, and then build a speech on that topic that is essentially a reflection on the importance of what's being said in this text. Okay, so it's an abstracted kind of thing, but then I use that to juxtapose abstract and speculative reasoning with case-based reasoning, right? Because I'm taking a rhetorical approach to teaching argumentation. And a rhetorical approach is based on the messiness of cases, dealing with actual cases, where you have people, their actions, conflicting motives, and so forth. Okay, so then they do the forensic unit, and I teach them a little bit about topoi, topics, topical logic. See, those topics help guide your inquiry into what is the question at stake in the case, which is very important in court of law, right? Okay, and there's a whole history there of forensic rhetoric that I introduce them to, and then the next unit is a unit on moral argumentation, which is my area of expertise. I teach them casuistry, actually. And casuistry is a method of moral argument that is especially useful in resolving dilemmas, that has been revived lately for use in medical ethics. I actually studied under Albert Johnson, who's the big name out at the University of Washington. he's the big name in medical ethics, is trying to revive Catholic casuistry as a means of equipping medical practitioners with a model that will help them resolve dilemmas. So anyway, I teach that to my students, and then I give them a Jehovah's Witness and blood transfusion case brief, 2-page case brief. And they use that to kind of get a handle on how you would attack an actual case. And then we have a mock ethics committee meeting, and then I give them a prompt that says you're an ethics consultant for this hospital, this case has been presented in 5 to 7 pages, analyze the case, identify the questions at issue in the case, and make a judgment, render your judgment, and then defend your judgment, hence moral argumentation. That's a unit. And then there's another unit that's a traditional, straight-up, deliberative approach to argumentation, where they take a policy controversy and be very much like in a 101 class. And all the way through, we have little debates and stuff like that to just kind of, I don't do any graded debates in that class. I do it more as impromptu. They're going to computer class. Thanks a lot, Katie. My daughter wanted to see me. So, yeah, it did. So, that is a left brain. That means the left brain. But then the class that I want to talk about today is the right brain equivalent of this, and that would be an advanced speech composition class. And they're both dovetailed perfectly to the fundamental section. Yes, sir, Mr. Bynum.
Thank you, Professor. Do you distinguish between the appeal to the passions and an appeal to the will? I realize that in Aristotle, he thinks the truth what is true has a natural advantage. So he tends to think you can appeal to either one and it's effective. Do you make a distinction there? Because you mentioned that yesterday between the moral rhetor, the person, and it occurs that you can appeal just to the emotions without regard to the appeal to the will or the truth.
Yes, but I would make the distinction that rhetoric has an inherently ethical component to it, and so cheesy appeals to emotion and something that's out of balance or that would warp the soul of the hearer would not be an available means of persuasion. Those are unavailable to the honest rhetor.
So you don't have any pre-law students?
I have a lot of pre-law students, but I try to urge that, I don't call that rhetoric, I call it sophistry or bombast or something else. Very much like I wouldn't call someone beating hell out of their child extreme discipline or bad discipline.
Right.
It's abuse. It changes names.
So the term
It's
is
different
actually
in kind. Yeah, and that whole argument eludes the vast majority of people in my discipline. They consider rhetoric an amoral tool like a gun. And that's bogus, in my opinion. But I think sophistry is stupid, as I said yesterday. Which I wish I hadn't put it that simply. Yeah, I should have. It didn't sound very academic.
We understood.
Okay, so that's the package, except that next year, I'm going to teach a unit very much like this, which I do need to get around to teaching now. But that one is going to be teaching oral interpretation classically. And because I learned oral interpretation classically at the University of Washington, and it's just wonderful, and I've been aching to teach it ever since '93. I haven't had an opportunity to teach it because the person in my department is very, that's his turf. But I'm going to use this as an outlet to do that, and I think that would be perfectly suited for younger kids in 6th, 7th grade. Oral interp is something that they really enjoy doing. So we're sleeping now. I put the Toshiba to sleep. Fortunately, I haven't put any of my students to sleep. Okay, so oral interp can be taught classically too, but then oral interpretation, get it? Argumentation and advanced speech composition emphasize logic and style and imagination, oral interpretation actually brings those together. So that would be the total package. If you work with your students in all of those ways, they would have a very, very solid foundation in rhetoric. Now, the public speaking course, let's get to it. The public speaking course really emphasizes oratory, the way I teach it. Okay? And I want to say this. I got a chance about 3 years ago or 4 years ago to fill in for my department head who was overloaded teaching public speaking. And I decided I just threw out the book. I'm not going to do what they do. I'm going to do what I've always thought would be the best approach to teaching this class. And I adopted an Imitatio Approach, which is based on a medieval model. You know, how weird is that at a cow college? But you know, the students just eat it up. And I have to admit, I also adopted a lot of elements from Toastmasters. So it's a very strange hybrid. But there are a lot of things in Toastmasters that are very valuable tools for equipping people for public speaking. The class that I'm teaching is a public speaking class. And public speaking entails much more than just simply getting up and giving speeches. So I have that element in there. But I'm going to focus on the classical element with you. I better do something with this before it goes to sleep again. We'll go down to the courses. And public speaking is right there. See that classical ed link there? Go like down. And the rhetoric ring. Is this working?
Yeah. It's kind of crunchy.
Oh, I see. This thing's old. I have a page that I'll show you after I'm done with this of helps for classical educators that I've been waiting with bated breath as Barnum for people to use. I spent hours and hours putting these resources after last year's conference, and I hustled to get it done by the end of summer so people would have it to use. So anyway, I think you'll find that very helpful. But these are what I call interactive syllabi for my students' use. But I want to show you.
If we go to speech 101, we'll get all of what you just said.
Yes.
The different.
But I don't think all my lecture notes and everything are there, but I put them on the web for you guys over at that help site. Yeah, I put everything, and I put the workbook from last year. I had this huge workbook that just completely bamboozled everybody. But I meant well. So this is much more laid back. And this is bothering me. I wish I could have looked at my Mac. We rock and roll here.
That's going, it's just.
Is it?
It's a grammar.
Just like attention.
Is that what I mean?
Why would it be so slow?
That's there we go.
Would it be the blazing speed coordination? Or
Yes.
It's just taking a lot of load.
So if I was going to apply this in my science course, which I was thinking about, you get the arguments and stuff like that, taking some of the classical experiments and stuff like that, and just do it with that, and I can do it.
My professor at the University of Washington, John Angus Campbell, had a course he taught in scientific, or how was it? A survey of rhetorical revolutions or something like that. But he's a rhetorician of science. And he's made his living analyzing everything about Darwin's, how Darwin made his ideas gain currency in the marketplace of ideas. And that's all a rhetorical enterprise. Oh, that's why it was long. Try learner. Here, let's just change the URL.
Let's go to Control-T.
I knew this would happen. I know what's wrong. Our server goes out all the time there. The server's down, I'll bet you. I'm going to have to explain it all. But I'd rather explain it. I could show you on my Mac too. probably all just about see it. Learn.
So you said John Angus Campbell was the fellow you studied?
John Angus Campbell was the fellow that I studied under. So he analyzes all of the Copernican revolution and the Baconian revolution and a lot of others, the American Revolution, examining the documents involved in those, the ones that they used. This is very Kuhnian. You follow me? Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. It's motivated by that to analyze how it is that they affected the revolution in thought, in worldview, how they shifted paradigms. And so, yeah, you could take what Steve was talking about theological debates, and apply that to scientific debates, and you've got a very rich approach to learning something about rhetoric. Guess what Luther's rhetoric is about? I went and ordered it yesterday because it's been bought. It's about what were the name of those lectures he gave, or sermons? In Vocabit sermons. And those had to do with what?
The Invocabit is after he returns from Wartburg, and Karlstadt has encouraged people to engage in iconic.
That's exactly who was talking about that yesterday?
I don't know.
Or was that last night at poolside? Okay. Anyway, lots of hanky-panky, lots of monkey business, so he comes back, and that's a very distinct rhetorical situation that he was faced with, and the strategies he used and the style of his arguments is the theme of this book. So it's exactly the same sort of thing that I think you're considering doing. So learn didn't work either?
No.
Yeah, okay.
Are you supposed to have a tilde or opinion in there?
No, don't need one in this one. It's, the server's down. The server goes down all the time. I was thinking last night, I bet my server will go down while I'm trying to teach this stuff. Maybe I made it happen. As Kenneth Hagin knows, you possess what you confess. Or Kenneth Copeland, you all know Kenneth Copeland. Okay, so I'll just show you what I was going to show you on here. It's a beginner screen. And I can maneuver around much faster, I think. $2.15. You may want to this is 215 help. Okay. 215 help. Okay, when you go there, when the server's up, you'll come on a page like this, and it's got it's got the current syllabus linked up here, it's got lecture notes, handouts, although for my public speaking class, I have no lecture notes. I haven't posted them because I essentially use my Speech 101 lecture notes for them, and then I just amplify some of the concepts that have to do with style and imagination. We just dwell on it a little bit more. Okay, and how'd you do that?
Just hit refresh and the server must be working.
I'm wasting so much time. This is the downside of technology, isn't it? Okay, so here you go. Have you read some of that then?
No.
While I was being a buffoon? There are speaking assignments designed to break the ice, but real application of classical concepts begins with a memorized speech. Students select a speech of interest from days of yore. They select a portion of it that can be performed in 6 minutes. I don't want to badger them, so I give them a 6-minute block that they need to work with. That includes an introduction. So they pretty much memorize 5 minutes of a speech. Okay, it's not too much, even for littler kids. They can memorize that much. And our kids all do catechism, so.
You said something yesterday that triggered, that I wanted to ask you about. You went through kind of some of the different elements of the speech. And then I think we got into a discussion about teaching the grammar, of the speech. And you mentioned that you just have folks memorize some speeches later on. Do you find that after they've memorized it, that then you're able to go through and teach them the components of the speech from that memorized work?
Yes, I always try to build on their experiences from previous exercises and assignments. And there's a chicken and egg thing that goes on, as we all well know, when we're teaching theory and trying to apply it, you can't fully equip somebody before they practice something, and they're not totally receptive to it until they've done it and stumbled through it a little bit. So you kind of have to always be sensitive to where you need to return and revisit concepts and then pull them forward and all that. It's a delicate balance that you have to maintain. But as far as the kids, the big struggle and about the trivia and all that, I don't think kids need the grammar of rhetoric in the beginning when they're young. I think you should get children involved in memorizing great speeches and even memorizing in Latin if you're really into Latin. There are all kinds of great orators in Greek and Latin if that's your approach, and you could have them do that. I wouldn't even begin to know how to approach it that way, but that would be very classical. In fact, Imitatio was done. Of course, they taught in Latin too then, but they would go back and they would commit to memory large portions of Greek and Latin speeches by Demosthenes and Cicero, all the great orators, and then they would simply recite them first. Then they would study the style, and then they would do variations on the style, and then eventually they graduate and they develop their own style. The whole point is, by the time you're done with the imitatio exercises, to develop your own voice based on a study of classical style. So there's a lot of imitation involved, but that gives a person a guide to developing their own style, and they're studying figures of speech and all of these elements and trying to master them. Okay, and that's exactly what that says. Let's see if we can actually go somewhere. This has happened before. You try to use this stuff and then you find out, oh, that's much faster. Yeah, it was just a hiccup in the server back there in South Dakota. Okay, see, these are all links. These are all links. So every assignment is explained. All right? Enough said. Right to imitatio. They give the informative speech, and then I give a little non-graded icebreaker kind of thing just to get people comfortable. You really do have to work out the jitters when kids are speaking in front of others. And especially if you're homeschooling and you get a consortium together in order to have an audience for the speakers, it's pretty hokey to just have your kids speaking to the parents, I think. They need an audience. But that can be nerve-wracking too. So there's going to have to be some icebreakers. Just keep it simple and let them get the butterflies out. Something of their choosing. But then, after that, they give a memorized speech, and then they study the master. The idea is they're supposed to pick a masterful speech, and then they learn by studying masters in action. Okay? And when you commit a speech to memory, you have to work virtually with every word, especially if it's from days gone by, because there's a lot of arcane language and references there that don't make sense anymore. And so it really is educational in a very deep sense, word by word. And if you can't pronounce a word, you have to figure that out. And if you think your inflection is off, you know, you're saying it out loud and listening to yourself, you have to work out the inflection, right? Can you see the value in that? Okay, so this explains the whole speech. I have a worksheet here that helps them get ready for this. You can see how I do that. What is the most powerful idea in your memorized speech? What makes it so powerful? What contemporary situation do you plan to address in order to demonstrate the continued relevance of that idea to your present audience? Why? I never did mention this. When they give their imitatio speech, they have to take the theme, they do an essentializing exercise where they figure out the essential theme of the speech. And the way they do that is they take stanza by stanza. Oratory is very poetic, so I just go ahead and call them stanzas rather than paragraphs. And they have to find the key line in each stanza of the speech, and then they have to reduce that to the key word within that line, and they essentialize the theme of the speech. It's just to get in touch with what is the essential theme. But then I make them apply the essential theme to a contemporary situation. As you can imagine, after 9/11, I had all kinds of speeches on what is patriotism, you know, what's the difference between jumping on the bandwagon and true patriotism, and how can we keep this going without it falling into mere jingoism or whatever. And all kinds of things about the virtues that came out in that tragedy. Okay? So I had a lot of people doing things like Patton's speech before D-Day and with swear words and everything. And then I had a lot of people do Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Declaration of War on December 7th, and then they would relate it to our Declaration on the War on Terrorism, stuff like that.
So before you give them the speech, you've already talked about style and all that stuff.
Yes, I have. I do all the equipping pretty much ahead of time.
Okay.
And we watch a lot of great speeches on tape. In the resources for classical educators, you'll find a resource list, and EVG is Educational Video Group. You can order great speeches on tape from them. I recommend exposing your students. If you're going to teach them rhetoric, you should show them some good examples. You should show them and study with them Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, the #1 speech of the century. You should study some JFK. You know, I show a medley of JFK speeches, including the inaugural address. He was a fine orator. Ronald Reagan. I have an address where you can get a tape called The Essential Reagan for 1995, and it shows just beautiful clips of his D-Day speech. Has anyone seen the 40th anniversary of D-Day? It's very moving. And then Mr. Gorbachev, Tear Down This Wall, and the eulogy to the Challenger crew. So I show them a nice variety.
Did you show them any Hitler?
Yes. Yeah. And I make a big argument because the narrator on that tape says, though you may disagree with Hitler, he's a strong example of rhetoric, and I just go ballistic on this. Remember our discussion earlier. I can't abide that view. It's socially agnostic to hold a view like that.
But he does, in fact, sometimes, he can sometimes be an evil individual, actually arguing for something good on rare occasion. But I don't know what you do with that.
Yeah.
Because
remember the tripartite division of ethos? Arete, phronesis, eunoia. The question is, do you have to possess those traits or merely exude them? in your speeches.
Interesting.
That's the big debate, and I fall down on the side that you should possess it. Quintillion, I need to tell you this. Quintillion, Institutes of Oratory. It's a 7-volume, I think it's the Harvard Classics. What's that other library? Are the Harvard Classics read, most of them?
Our Harvard classics are in 5 different colors, 10 volumes of each color.
Well, there's the Harvard Classics, and then there's the Loeb Classical Library.
Loeb was published by Harvard initially.
Okay.
Which moved back and forth.
All right.
So you get some Loebs which are.
Well, you know those small volumes, there are like 4 volumes of the Institutes of Oratory of Quintillion. He was a contemporary of Paul, the Apostle, and he has...
I think the Latin I read and the Greek read is that right?
That sounds right. That sounds right, yeah. Because I know my Aristotle from the Loeb is green. So anyway, Quintillion has what's considered the seminal work in the Western tradition on training orators. So, and he breaks it down. He begins with speaking to them in the cradle. You know, it's that extensive. And he goes on. So, classical educators would really find that helpful, I think. All right, now, this is just a silly little exercise for them to do. Control, is it control backspace?
Control up here.
Back down. It's not working. This is one funky computer. Okay, explanation. Human excellence, you've seen that. That's what I had on the PowerPoint yesterday. Okay, so lots of explanation here. Now, I teach them about the sublime. Have you ever heard of Longinus on the sublime? I'm way over already, aren't I? Okay. Did you get the idea? I really wanted to go through this systematically. I'm sorry for it being so disjointed. Let me just show you a couple of things real fast. There's the Emporium. Well, there's supposed to be a discussion now. Are they doing that discussion in the theater? Does anyone know? I didn't really get the plan for that.
They were supposed to have a question and answers a few minutes before.
Okay. Well, here's... I just realized Dr. I forget his name now. There was supposed to be a vice president from here in our class today. There's that Joseph Dunn quote, and there's a section for invention, disposition, style, memory, and delivery. I'll go to the one for invention quickly, just to show you how I handle that. This is really in the rudimentary stages here. The Speech Builders Emporium. I wrote a grant proposal for this summer to fill this out, and it wasn't awarded. Okay, so these are the kind of questions you get from students a lot, you know. How do I narrow, what if, but this topic is boring? Every topic is potentially boring if you think about it.
If you work on it.
Yeah. Okay, so I talked to him about the fear that my topic is boring. Now, see, you would never get this with your students.
Oh,
Yeah, right.
This is funny. This is funny. I got them on this. What we have here are links to... I tell them, you know, you need to get a thought life, get interested in something. So, that's Ref Desk, that's a news link, that's Saturday Night Live, that's Monty Python Online, this is greatbooks.org, and so I just have maps, the teaching company, and then this is just our library search site. And did you read this thing scrolling by? Okay, so, that's that one. Oh, I have
How is it?
to click. Style.
Do you ever have your students help you with your website or not really?
Haven't gotten to it. Well, actually, I asked them if they find an interesting link to email it to me, and I added it in. Okay, so this is my little tribute to style. And here's Sir Francis Bacon's definition of rhetoric that I mentioned. Pique the imagination, stir the emotions, move the will. That sounds kind of mechanical, actually. But I build the approach to style on his definition, so I think it complements Aristotle's definition really well, and it pulls it forward several hundred years. That's one thing I did want to mention, friends. The history of rhetoric. I just talked about Aristotle yesterday. This is very rich history. Rhetoric is one of the most self-conscious disciplines there is, and it's really, really rich. There's 2,500 years of nonstop conversation about rhetoric, and so you can go on. If you have advanced students that really really want to take it up, there are all kinds of readings that you can do, and I highly recommend Richard Beaver for conservatives. There's my glossary of schemes and tropes. You may remember.
Is there starting work with this, you recommend?
Yes, Visions of Order. It's available from ISI, Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Visions of Order, the cultural crisis of our time. Actually, what I recommend is reading the Phaedrus and Richard Weaver's essay, The Phaedrus and the Nature of Rhetoric, side by side. It's superlative commentary on Plato's Phaedrus. The Phaedrus, Phaedrus, and then Weaver's essay is called The Phaedrus and the Nature of Rhetoric. That, in fact, is one of the reasons I hold that view about rhetoric being inherently ethical. That and studying a lot of Aristotle. Okay, there's one more place I've mentioned that I wanted to show you, and then I'll just be quiet. And that would be at the Rhetoric Ring. I really had envisioned this being a lot more helpful to you as far as really getting into the nitty-gritty, but the technology got in the way. Okay, see that? There's your link. This is the Rhetoric Ring front page. There's my disclaimer to the public educators. It essentially says, we're going to talk about this from a Christian point of view, so back up! Back up! Go away if you're easily offended atheist who doesn't like the fact that this is a nation under God. Okay, so here we go. I've got it all there, and you will notice there are a lot more links here than some of those other things that I put up, because I wanted to make sure you got the whole enchilada. It's all here for your use. And at the bottom, there are more links, more resources, and that's where I put all of those, the workbook from last time. And you know what? I took a big risk because I took things from my undergraduate days and put them on here, but I thought, okay, I'm a PhD, I've been at this for 15 years, but if I go back and put my undergrad notes, I think they'll be a lot more accessible to beginners. So that's why I did that, but That's very risky, especially if some of my colleagues see that I'm posting, you know.
Maybe they won't get past that Christian disclaimer.
Yeah,
You could have like an adult ID thing.
my department head, that would be her image. What's he put this on a state site for? What was that?
You get like the adult ID thing where you have to go get.
Yeah. A litmus test.
Yeah.
Okay, so down here is the workbook from last year, and then I think you'd like virtually all of these, and this is my tribute to Richard Weaver here, there's some good stuff. I think if you read that, you'll want to go to the ISI site, and, or they have several of these books. That Visions of Order is like $12.95 or something. They sell their books really cheap.
Well, this is excellent. So we have the De Doctrina, you have the Adam Smith.
Those are simplistic. The De Doctrina is a oral report that I delivered on it, so it's my notes from the oral report. It's not in-depth study of it.
But it's still, I mean, it's very valuable because I don't think a lot of people have wade through the De Doctrina Christiana. I think that's going to be much more helpful.
Yeah, you'll get the essentials from it.
I mean,
I don't even know what it is.
it's his defense and exposition of Christianity. Well, Professor, tell us, what is this about, this De Doctrina Christiana?
Well, St. Augustine, as a matter of fact, I don't have an exposition of the whole theme, but really what I did is I focused on those elements. He does talk to preachers in there about the uses of pagan rhetoric in the church, in the word of the church. And
Yes.
there's always been this big debate. There's always been this big debate about what Concord hath Rome and Athens, or Athens, Athens. In the 3rd and 4th century, it was a huge debate, and Augustine made a real strong argument that, you know, this stuff is useful for us, and
Plundering the Egyptians is the phrase.
plundering the Egyptians.
Homeschoolers are correct, and use that.
Yeah. And Luther engaged in that in Melanchthon, they engaged in that discussion. It never dies, it's still alive today, right?
As some of your own poets have known.
Yeah. So I don't know, what, you want to take a peek at that? Let's see what's there.
But now this is Christian, so we have to make sure we don't look too long, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right, you don't want to sully yourself.
So then basically when Augustine says the truth is the truth, regardless of where it comes from, this is his exposition at that point. Or do you think it's more involved in that?
I don't really recall, you know, I haven't even thought about that for years. I haven't been reading De Doctrina. I just gave a report on it in grad school, and that's about 1990. So here's what that has to offer you. But I would ask too, as long as if you're surfing the website, I do have something that I would be much obliged if you would look over, or purely vanity, reasons of vanity. It's a piece that I had published on casuistry. Remember, I don't think I did mention casuistry yesterday. In my bio section here, I have a sample of writings I've done, and I did my PhD on casuistry, which I think I did mention today. And so I have a piece. This is in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Rhetoric. And I'm asking you to read it because in part, I would like to see how accessible you find it. And in part too, I think it would help tie some things together for you in terms of ethics and phronesis, dialectic, and rhetoric. So you find that on my bio page, writing sample. Let's see, do I have, this is something completely different. That's a Platonic dialogue I wrote. You guys, it's pretty funny. And teaching morals badly and its consequences, I know you'd like that too. It's an attack on using fear appeals to program kids to care about things. But I was hoping that I have a speech I gave, One Nation Under God Still. It used that farewell quotation from Dr. Kopp's speech last night, the farewell address of Washington. I used that and talked about what our true heritage is and that we ought not compromise away in the name of separation of church and state and all that sort of thing. I don't have that posted, I guess, but I was pretty proud of that. And it really had the same kind of ring to it as what he was talking about last night. But I have had a number of students also, this is one of the things I really like about teaching rhetoric, I've had a number of students commit that to memory, those passages out of Washington's farewell address. And then they talk to their class about, not in a preachy way, but in a patriotic way, about how a free society requires a moral populace. And that was an axiom for the founders, and how we've lost that notion. Why we better watch out because we're on the brink. So, yes, Paul.
A few questions.
Can you turn that off now? Probably does need a fan.
One thought I have, but it's just more of a concept at this point, but as we get into American history, probably in either at the junior high or high school level, a lot of the Rhetoric phases, if you will, is having kids studying some things about American history by going back and studying some of the inaugural addresses of
You're darn
the
tootin'.
presidents.
Thank you.
And would that work, you think?
That's a great way to learn history, because you've got the event of the speaking occasion. Let's use the Constitutional Convention. You could have them look at Benjamin Franklin's address, and I can't remember the key speeches of that, but I was thinking Gettysburg Address. Okay, they could go and work with the Gettysburg Address and learn something about style and figures of speech and that sort of thing, but also the history surrounding the Gettysburg Address and the day, the event, that the governor gave a 3-hour address and then Lincoln gave a speech. And you can learn a lot about the history through the rhetoric. And there's a very close link between them. And if you wanted to, I'm in the process of proposing an honors colloquium at my college with colleagues from English, history, and myself, doing exactly what you're talking about. So we would read the literature of the civil rights movement, some of the key works in the civil rights movement, and then listen to I Have a Dream and a few other key speeches from that time, and then learn some of the history of it. It's a perfect combination, and I think they play off one another in a way that's really satisfactory in terms of learning. I think the retention is better. It contextualizes the history a little bit better for the student, in my opinion.
Isn't Lincoln's second inaugural address that's often held up as a tremendous example? From what you're saying, it occurs that Lincoln's second inaugural is actually an amazing piece of work as well. Because
I don't know. I've never really studied that one. I've studied the Cooper Union Address and the House Divided.
And the Douglas
Lincoln
debates
Douglas
are great,
debates,
right?
yeah. But I've never really studied his inaugural address.
And evidently, people see in the second inaugural address, Lincoln moved from a roughly deist position where he has a Christian background and upbringing. But here you actually see Lincoln later in life actually coming to something approximating a faith. I don't know if you can read that much into it, but people have said that.
Yeah. Well, are there any other nuts and boltsy type questions, or I really had wanted to give you something solid that you could apply.
But it is nice to have that resource.
Right.
And I'll help in any way I can. You email me if there's something that's not there that you think I might have. I have a folder marked to post on the rhetoric ring. It's pretty fat. So I just haven't had time to get it all.
Have you ever interacted with, spoken with any profs in the practical departments of the seminaries about just preaching and some things that could be learned from rhetorical style?
Weinrich, and well, Dr. came to my church 5 years ago, and he said, you know, rhetoric is something missing in our curriculum because we used to have a rhetorician on board, but he passed away. And he said, ever since then, we've been filling this lack. And so I jumped on that, of course, being the opportunist I am. And then I was working with Dr. Weinrich on it. He had his heart attack, or got sick, whatever it was. I'm not sure about all that. And then it really hasn't. And then I talked to Larry Rast about it too, but nothing's ever come of it. They're just swamped. They're too busy. So someday I'm supposed to go out there and do a little pilot study in the summer. But I mean, there's a very rich history of homiletics from a rhetorical point of view that would really enhance the preachment, according to the people I talked to.
As a very practical, simple thing, I mean, you mentioned intonation earlier.
Yeah.
Now, it strikes me frequently when I visit around different churches, even in my own church, just the way the scripture readings are done.
Yeah.
If the emphasis is not put in the correct parts, so much is missed.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
I just started the organist workshop level 2 weeks ago. One of the pastors on Thursday got speaking too fast for the chapel's acoustics. And at supper, I said, do you mind a word of advice from an old speech teacher? You know, that's an inimical room. It didn't like the way he was moving that sermon, and nobody could understand him because the echoes in the room so you overpowered your words. He says, I get going too fast when I get off my topic, and I got off of my top line, and he said, so you're right, that the delivery, the stylistics, part of that. And
Paul was an
not only
audience.
but not only the audience, but the location and things like that. All those
Beyond that, the artifice of rhetoric. Paul was a Hellenist. Hellenism was based on a rhetorical curriculum. Rhetoric was the capstone of the traditional liberal arts. And his writings reflect that. You can follow his train of thought so much better if you understand rhetoric and dialectic. And if you understand figures of speech and how they work, it's really hard to miss when you're reading into, miss a nuance. You just pick up the nuances better if you're trained in this. You're more sensitive to it. So it's very enriching in many, many ways.
I ran across a commentary recently on 1 Corinthians, and you probably are familiar with Gordon Fee.
Oh, sure.
Who wrote it. He's written a number of
I've heard
commentaries.
his name.
No, but not Fee. This one, actually, I take it back. This was Worthington. It was written a lot on, all the women in the Bible and all. Well, he did a commentary on 1 Corinthians, and he analyzed the book of 1 Corinthians using Greek rhetoric and its conventions, and showed how Paul really was following a lot of the conventions of classical
He uses
rhetoric.
rhetorical questions
The way that
for
he
transitions many times.
Yeah.
And use antithesis all the time.
Mhm.
if you understand that, it influences the way you read it. And that's what these new Bibles that are using Chi structure and all, they're reviving the understanding of Hebrew and Greek form. That really enhances, because they didn't divide out form and content the way we do. And it enhances your interpretation of the scripture. So there's some implications here for hermeneutics as well as homiletics. But I've told people too, I've had the experience many times, I've taught this in Sunday school, these kind of things. And when couples start to learn something about dialectic and rhetoric and logic and stuff, it enhances their marriage too, because their arguments are more productive. The worst thing I ever did is have my wife attend a couple of classes. She wins a lot of arguments. I can't subjugate her anymore. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.